Have you seen some of the horror stories about those DMCA takedown notices that some podcasts are getting on their shows? If you haven't seen any of the headlines lately, well, let me promise you, this is a legal battle that you do not want to find yourself in. And that is why in this episode, we are covering a topic that is not talked about nearly enough in the podcasting space, which is how do you protect your podcast to keep other people from stealing the hard work that you're doing on your show? I have got podcast and entertainment lawyer Gordon Firemark here in the studio to break down some of the most overlooked legal protections that are so simple to put in place and that every podcaster needs to have in place so that you never have to find yourself in a legal mess that you can't undo. And yes, even if you're just getting started or if you think your audience is too small right now for this to matter, I promise you, waiting until it's a problem is a mistake that you don't want to make. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Gordon, welcome to the show.
Hey, Courtney, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to have you. This is a topic that needs to be talked about more in the podcasting space specifically. And for those listening right now, look, I know your expertise, Gordon, is rooted in U.S. law, and we've got listeners that tune in from all over the world. So for you listening, if that's you, some of the principles we're going to cover here today are universal in many ways. There might be some nuances for you living outside of the U.S. This is where your local attorney is going to be very key. But Gordon, I know that you're going to be able to point us in the right direction of what we need to be thinking about. By the way, how is that for a legal disclaimer?
That's great. Yeah, and you're right. The international stuff there are nuances and little differences, so it is worth checking with somebody local. But the good news is that most of what we'll be talking about really is universal, covered by, the British common law, which at one point kind of encompassed most of the world. So we're off to a good start with the information we're going to get here.
All right. Well, before we dive into what specifically podcasters need to be thinking about to protect everything that they're working so hard to build with their podcast, I'd love to get your take on why legal protection matters so much for podcasters. And I guess deeper than that, what's the real risk for those who skip this?
Look, legal protection is important for any business and for any aspect of a business. There are going to be the legal wrinkles that are sort of unique to that business. And if you don't have these things covered, there's a good chance that nothing bad's ever going to happen. The real trouble is if it does, when it does. So it's sort of an insurance policy. It's a way of getting some confidence that you've got things lined up so that you can be bold and take some kinds of actions that the less protected, the less structured folks may be a little timid about. And, bold, fortune favors the bold, as they say.
Yeah. And for me, Gordon, we'll get into trademarks here in a second, but I can remember when I actually did pursue my first trademark, it gave me a lot of confidence in what I was building because suddenly I knew that it was protected. And it seems maybe a little counterintuitive, but I know that it did that for me. So as I was preparing this episode, I was looking and I'm like, okay, I've got a list of at least 11 different areas that I think podcasters need to think about when it comes to protecting themselves legally. You might tell me there's more than that. What I would love to do is just kind of zero in on the core things that we need to do as podcasters. Let's start with copyrights. Those listening right now, at least here in the US, may or may not realize that when you hit publish on an episode, you are automatically protected to some degree with copyrights. But what about beyond that? Should we be registering our episodes with the Copyright Office? And what about for podcasters that have global audiences? Does that copyright protection extend internationally? Or are there other limitations that we need to know about?
Copyright's sort of this bundle of rights that the author or the owner, the creator of a work gets just by the act of creating the thing. And, it protects that person's exclusive right to make copies and distribute them and perform and display and make derivative works and things like that. And that protection lasts for, a good long time. Usually 70 years after the author's death is the expiration date for a modern copyright. There is a registration mechanism here in the United States, and it's a good idea to register, certainly for cornerstone content. But it's a little bit of a tricky question because there's an expense associated with this registration. And if you're putting out an episode every week and filing that registration, it's $65 per work. And at the current moment, there's no one way to do like an umbrella for 10 episodes at a time. And so it's expensive. So most folks don't. And the good news is you don't have to register in order to be protected. You do in the US have to register in order to bring a lawsuit for copyright infringement. But you can do that up to the day before you file the lawsuit, basically. So if you get a really big, important theft and the defendant's off making millions of dollars of profit, just register and sue them. Another little bit of good news is that for most of what we deal with in the digital media space, if there's an infringement, it's likely to be an online infringement. Somebody posted your content somewhere else. The DMCA takedown procedure doesn't require the registration. So you can have a copyright and enforce it to an extent, even without that registration.
Great to know. Okay, so what about putting like a copyright notice in your episode footer? Is that redundant since it's already being covered and inherently protected by copyright from the moment it's published, or is that a good idea to do?
So copyright notices, it's always a good idea. It eliminates the possibility that somebody claims, well, I didn't know it was protected. So it's a good idea to put that little C in a circle and the name and the year, the name of the owner and the year. And a little lesser known tidbit is that if you're putting it on something that is a recording, a sound recording, the symbol is a P in a circle for phonorecord. It goes back, it's archaic, but that's the way it is. But no, the notice is not required. It's just another good idea.
I would think a deterrent too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so that's really helpful as far as copyrights go. Let's talk about trademarks and protecting your IP beyond that. Because as I have been going through this process myself and learning kind of through the school of hard knocks, the ins and outs of the legal side of protecting your business and by extension, your podcast, trademarks, I've learned, don't actually protect all of your IP, but they can protect your brand. They can protect a name. They can protect a logo. So can you break this down for us, for those listening who may have concerns about maybe their unique methodology that they're teaching in their podcast and also the unique branding elements of that podcast?
Yeah. So IP, intellectual property, is sort of an umbrella term, and it covers several classes of this intangible product of the mind kind of property that we create. Copyright is one of them. Trademark is another. It protects the unique, distinctive symbols, word marks, the brand, the things that you use to identify yours as differentiated from others in the marketplace. Very much like the branding with, you use a branding iron to sear a symbol into the side of a cow to show which ranch this cow was raised on. So that's branding, and that's what trademark protects. So if you've come up with a distinctive title for your show, I strongly recommend registering that so you don't wind up with 6 other shows in the directories with similar names that confuse your audience. Likewise, if you have segments of your show that are distinctive names, I mean, I always think back to like David Letterman with The Guy Under the Stairs, or those kinds of things. That was valuable intellectual property that he claimed ownership of when the show moved over to the other network. You can, again, the name for something like a framework or a methodology is another thing. If you've come up with, again, distinctive name, you can register that, and it's a very good idea. Other kinds of intellectual property are patents for inventions and unique and not obvious systems and methods. That's pretty unusual for folks in this creator space. And then the fourth one that isn't exactly intellectual property, but it sort of fits well in the category, is the trade secret. And that is about keeping your secrets secret and using contracts and a non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality clause in an employment agreement, for example, to make sure that people you do share information with aren't blabbing it around to the whole world or using it for their own benefit without your consent.
For that one, there's no specific registration for a trade secret. However, you want to make sure you are protecting that if you are sharing that intellectual property, let's say a unique methodology that you're teaching or letting someone else in on that a non-disclosure would protect you from. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Just bringing in your team members, and you don't want the whole world to know who the upcoming guests are or things like that. And the contract is the promise to keep it secret.
So do you recommend having those work on your team sign NDAs if they're working on your podcast?
I recommend that every person on your team signs a contract that includes a confidentiality clause. Sometimes all it is a non-disclosure agreement. Sometimes it's a broader independent contractor or co-host agreement or something like that.
Got it. Well, let's move on to music because this is the one that I think most podcasters, this pops into their mind when they think about protecting my podcast or being legally compliant. We've all heard these horror stories about, the takedown notices and the legal minefield that music can be for podcasters. What's the best way to ensure that you're fully covered, especially if your show is distributed internationally?
Well, the best way is to use music that you have paid for licenses for. And typically that means what we call royalty-free music, where you pay once and it's yours to use. You got to be careful with that because a lot of the royalty-free licensing companies do it on a single-use basis. So if you're using it for the opening of your show every week, now you're paying for that license every week. So read the fine print carefully as you go for these things. But royalty-free music is a great way. There's also Creative Commons, which is a sort of where the authors, the owners of the work, can just say to the community, go ahead and use it. Here are my conditions. And as long as you live up to those conditions, you should be fine. Or hire a composer to create something original for you as a work for hire that you then own. And then you don't have to worry about paying anybody royalties.
That, I think, is the best of all worlds right there, because it's unique to you. It's unique to your podcast. It's protected. You don't ever have to worry about it. But what about if you have a podcast where maybe you are, I heard a podcast the other day where the two hosts talk about rap songs that they listen to, and they play a clip of the rap song, and nowhere did I see that it was disclosed that they had the artist's consent to do that. They play the clip and then they talk about it. What about in instances like that if you're bringing in external media and that is a significant piece of your show?
Well, a lawyer's favorite expression is it depends. And I'm going to say it depends in this case. It depends on the way you're using it, because in the First Amendment area, we have freedom of speech, at least here in the U.S., and many countries around the world have similar principles. So the law has developed a mechanism for allowing certain kinds of free speech uses. Here in the U.S., it's called fair use. And in other countries, it's called fair dealing. Here in the U.S., we have this complicated 4-factor test or a way of evaluating whether something is a fair use. And it really depends in large part, how much are you using and how are you using it? What's the purpose and character of that use? Is it educational or critical, or is it more entertainment and just exploitative kind of use? And then the how much, if you're using 3 seconds of a 3-minute song, it's probably not a big deal. If you're using 40 or 50 seconds, maybe it is. A lot of times when you describe a show like you did, where they're talking about a song or analyzing a rap lyric, that's educational and critical commentary kind of a use. And as long as they're not using too much, they should be okay. The real problem, Courtney, with this fair use thing is you have to do the analysis for every single clip. It's not something you can create a rule of thumb or a blanket approach to. So but generally, I say, stay away from that if you can. But once in a while, you mention something and you want to play a few seconds of it, you probably get away with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about AI. We're seeing these AI tools like voice cloning becoming more common, right? We've had ChatGPT and things of that sort for a long time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that content that's generated by AI currently, even if it sounds like your voice, even if you are the one speaking it and you outlined it via ChatGPT, technically isn't owned by anyone. So does that mean if you clone your voice or you're using AI to create, let's say, a script or the content that goes into your episode, does that mean you don't have legal protection over what you've created, even if it's based in your unique ideas?
The regulating authorities here in the U.S., it's the U.S. Copyright Office, other places, different names for the organizations. Basically, the rule has been if it doesn't have a human author, then it is not entitled to copyright protection. And they've basically said, writing a prompt isn't authorship because you didn't have enough control over the specifics of the output. So you're right, a script that's written by AI, not protected. But when I sit down and record that script into a camera or a microphone, I own the recording of that script, and anything else original that I've brought to the thing is mine. Somebody else, though, could get a transcript of what I said and then reread it into their microphone and put out their recording of it. And that's sort of the danger of relying too heavily on something like AI. In the scenario where you have the voice clone, well, you didn't create that work either. So now the recording is probably not copyrightable until you edit it and compile it into something bigger or different and transform it into a more human created thing.
Mm-hmm. This is so interesting to me because I think AI is new in many senses to all of us. And a lot of us aren't even thinking about the legal repercussions or ramifications of utilizing AI. I'm a big proponent of please always use your voice in your episodes. Your audience needs that to feel connected to you. Your podcast is going to struggle to grow without it. And yes, some of these AI clones are interesting and they're tempting because it's like, oh gosh, I could scale myself. Yes and no, we could have a whole nother episode on that. But the legal ramifications are important to think about because, well, here you are. If you're creating a podcast, but it's 100% your voice clone, well, if you're not taking those additional steps, as you said, to really have a work that is composite and compiled by you or with enough of you in it to earn those protections, you could be getting yourself into trouble there.
Yeah, I think it's important to just think of the AI as a tool that you use, not a replacement for a person.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that, I think is one of the most easily overlooked legal tools in podcasting is the guest release form. Or this may be something where someone just grabbed a template off ChatGPT or somewhere, say, hey, write me a quick guest release template. And they're so important that we're actually going to devote the entire next episode to these, what they need to include, when you need to use them, where you need to use them, how to ensure you're protected. But before we get there, Gordon, I want to ask you, for those that are listening right now, and maybe they're thinking, I'm not big enough yet to be at risk. I have 12 people that listen to my episodes, or this all sounds great, but I'd rather spend the time and money that I have right now growing my audience. What would you say to those people who maybe don't have a sense of the deeper ramifications of not having these protections in place as it relates to your reputation in the industry and the brand that you're looking to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the biggest mistake that creators make is they wait, or they think they should or can wait until sometime later. And waiting too long is the biggest mistake. I've seen it in the trademark space. I've seen it in the not getting a guest release space where, later somebody comes and asks to take down or edit an episode, and then it's sort of too late to ask them to sign something that says you don't have to. So that's a big mistake. And yeah, I think that your reputation, when you get that takedown, now there's a gap in your podcast's RSS feed, and maybe people will notice, maybe they won't. If you have sponsors for your podcast, sponsor who paid for that episode is not going to be happy that it's no longer available for the audience to hear their message, right? So there's another hit to your reputation and possibly your pocketbook. And there's just a myriad of things that can go wrong. You don't see it coming. I say, get this legal stuff taken care of early and really get that sense that you've got it done so you can be confident, and then take some more risks than you would otherwise.
Yeah, it's one of those things like going to the doctor, getting those annual exams or tests. It's like none of us really like to do that because we really don't want to see what the test might be, but then you have that peace of mind. And so to me, I love what you brought up here at the beginning of our conversation, which was it's an insurance policy and looking at it that way rather than an expense. Because yes, it could become expensive, on the one hand down the road, it could become very expensive very quickly. But on the other hand, it's a small price to pay, in my opinion, for the protection that it gives you, the peace of mind that it gives you. And then, like I said, when I got that very first trademark in my business years ago, it was like, now I'm building something, and I'm building something that's mine. And it allows you to just pursue that thing with more confidence. At least it has for me. So Gordon, thank you for being here today to share your wisdom with us. And I'm really excited to get into specifically guest releases with you here in the next episode.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Well, without further ado, head on over with us to the next episode where we are going to dive into guest releases, the one legal protection that every podcaster needs to have in place. And lucky for you, it's going to take you less than 5 minutes to actually implement. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.